Welcome to A Beginner's Guide to Mixing Metal at Home. This is episode 3, part 2, dealing with the guitars. In part 1 we covered how to get your guitar tone and decide where in the stereo space to fit them, and in this episode we're going to discuss how to bring them all together into your stereo track that you're going to process and sit in the rest of the mix. So I've bounced down my guitars to a single stereo track to work with here so that you can see, and I'll just give you a quick listen there. Now that doesn't sound too bad as it is. That's a good thing. With guitars they don't handle processing as well as some other instruments. You can easily go too far with them and they can start to sound very fake. So the cleanest, best sound you can get with your initial bounce down or your initial mix of using your amp simulation, the better that will be later on down the line. First thing we're going to deal with is some EQ. I'm using the Cubase standard EQ again, just because it's free with the program. And as you can see, that might be a bit of a surprise to you if you've not looked at this before. It looks fairly extreme, but what will be even more surprising is the effect it has on the sound. I'll just give a very quick overview here. You can see there's a good high pass filter here cutting down, starting at around 200 and pulling off. You don't really want any guitar noise below 100 at all, really. You've got everything below the sort of 150 you should really reserve for your bass and your kick drum, and the guitars down that end are going to start to get very woofy and very sort of low MIDI, so I like to cut a lot of that out. The exact frequencies will vary on your guitar, but you will need to have a good shelf there so that you're freeing up that low end energy for the proper bass instruments. At the top end, this is what really surprised me when I first learnt about it, was how severe the high shelf is, or the low pass filter. It's pretty extreme. Mine starts here at around 5,000-6,000 hertz, although the setting here for that cutoff is around 8,000. It starts having an effect from about 6,000. And really, that's cutting off a lot of high-end fizz, and those high-end frequencies can get quite fatiguing on the ear, and they can take up energy as well in the other high instruments. Some parts of the vocals sit around the 2 to the 6K mark, and if you cut some of them out, you can let your vocals shine through a bit, but you do have to play around because your guitar sound will vary from mine. You will need quite a severe one. Anything from sort of 6 to 10K is going to be your magic mark, and you want to make a big cut off there. I've also identified with this second one here in the middle at around the 750 hertz, I identified a sort of frequency that was booming a bit with my mids, and I wanted to pull that down a bit. So always do check for those. Almost certainly you will find some that aren't so pleasant that you want to pull down a bit, but it's only 2 dB I'm pulling down there because I got a fairly good EQ on the initial sound. But let's see, what will surprise you probably quite a lot on this is that when we play it, you probably won't hear much difference. This is without the EQ, and with. Now that's actually a good thing that we haven't heard much difference there. The guitar isn't a bass instrument, so we don't want those bass energies there. That's not always going to be the case. Sometimes you will need to tweak your EQ a bit, but you also will find sometimes that it's necessary to add in effects like this that don't have too much audible difference, but are necessary nonetheless. Following that, this is a plugin that I've used on the drums. This is the Waves C4 Multiband compressor. It's particularly good for guitars. There's one area of guitars that people can have trouble with, and that's the low mids. It can be a bit of a muddy sound. The reason I'm using a multiband compressor here instead of an EQ, you could think, why didn't I just use my EQ to sort out my low mids, is that if you pull your low mids out too much, you're going to get a very weak sounding guitar. By using a multiband compressor, you can just tell it, okay, leave the low mids until they hit a certain threshold and then rein them in. And that's what I've done here. Everything's pretty flat except for one setting around the 250, which is roughly where you'll find the low mid muffle on a guitar. I've pulled that down by 3 dB. If we have a listen to that again without the C4 and then with it, you will see that it doesn't make too much difference to the sound again. There's not going to be much activity, just occasionally it's going to pull down the low mid noise and stop it sounding that little bit of muddiness that can creep in with guitars. Here we go. So here's without and with. See, there's very little movement going on there. Again, that's a good thing. You can't process guitars too extremely, otherwise you will ruin the sound, frankly. Now, I can't claim credit for this. Just very quickly, I have to say that I got this from the Ultimate Metal forum, the Andy Sneap sub forum. This is one of his infamous settings. You can Google the Andy Sneap C4 setting. It's something that most people mixing metal will have come across at some point. Very handy to use. So that sits in after the EQ. Thirdly, I'm just adding in a bit of compression to tighten the guitars up a bit. I'm using this Density Mark II stereo compression bus that I've used on the drums before as well to fill them out a bit. You could use a ordinary compressor that comes with like Cubase, and you wouldn't want too much. Maybe as this default setting is just a ratio of 2:1. You don't need to tighten up your guitars too much. If you've already bounced them down as I have with a boosted signal before the amp, you can see here it's a fairly even tone as it is. You don't want to pull out too much life from that, and a tiny bit of compression, something like this, a 2:1 with a threshold of -20 there. That is all you would need to just tighten the sound up a bit. And really, that acts more as a volume controller than anything else. If I give you a quick example. As with anything compressed, it's just sort of giving it a bit more tightness, a bit more body. Worth putting one in there, but as I say, it doesn't matter whether you were to use this density that I've used, which is from Variety of Sound. I'll put a link in at the bottom, free VST, or the standard Cubase compressor. I find the density just gives a bit nicer tone. One final trick, once we've got them, that's a very well regulated guitar tone. Individually, none of them have made much difference, but together they will pull your tone together and give it some clarity and allow it to sit well in a mix. Just to liven them up a bit though, I add one final thing in, which is a saturation plugin. This is again another free one by Variety of Sound, the same guy that does the density. He has a lot of free VSTs, so I do recommend checking his website out. Saturation plugin adds some analog feel to the sound again, and especially with guitars that can be important. It's harmonic saturation that emulates the analog kit of old, where hardware used to, when it was in the analog domain, used to add character, add its imprint to any signal that came through it, and we've lost that within the digital domain, but programs like this try and add it back in. And what it does is it manipulates the sound slightly, it excites harmonics, and you can really mess around with the dynamics knob here. Will decide how many harmonics it's messing around with, and the saturation decides to what extent you're doing that. Again, these settings will vary for yourself, and it's quite subtle. But what it does is it almost is the difference between maybe a solid state amplifier and a tube amplifier. It gives it that nice analog, crunchy extra bit of body to it that you do lack when you try and go through the digital domain. On its own, again, it will be a very subtle effect. What I'm going to do is turn all of these on and mute each one. I'm going to play you the guitar loop and add in all of these, and you'll see individually they make very little effect, but together it will be a nice addition to the overall sound. So here we go. Individually, as I was turning them on, you probably saw there wasn't too much difference, but by the time you get to the end of that 4-chain plugin, it's given the guitars more body, but there's still a very controlled signal. And it's important with guitars to have that controlled volume throughout the track, because a lot of guitar frequencies are going to conflict with the vocals. and some of them with the cymbals, but by cutting out a lot of the high end, we reduce that slightly. Really, that's about all I would like to do with my guitars. As I say, they don't lend themselves well to over production and over processing, so anything you do should be subtle, and you really want to concentrate on that initial guitar sound, get it sounding as good as you can before you move forward to any of these plugins. And when you do add a plugin, you don't want to be changing the sound dramatically. Each one should be adding something subtle to just tidy the tone up slightly, and your end result should be a nice, tidy, tight, but yet powerful guitar sound that you can fit in your mix and hopefully sit your vocals on without them conflicting too much. One other problem guitars can do, because they cover a wide spectrum and distortion is effectively a white noise sitting on the tone, is they can obscure other instruments, maybe some cymbals, maybe your snare. So you might want to go into your initial EQ, or even after you've done these effects, put a final EQ on top of it all again. Nothing wrong with doing that, and look at your overall sound and maybe notch out one or two other frequencies that might be conflicting with something else. If you've got something like the snare being hidden, you might be able to find a frequency on the guitars you can pull down a bit to allow the snare some room without affecting the overall sound. You may find, though, because the guitars are very prominent in metal, that you have to end up going back to the other sound, such as, say, your snare, and actually alter that instead, because with the guitars you pull out too many of the frequencies and it's going to start sounding weird. So it's all a balancing act, and as I said at the beginning of the guitar episode 1, preparation, having a vision towards your final mix is key with especially something like heavy metal, where you've got to balance your EQs everywhere. You've got to have a clear idea of where everything's going to sit, and you've also got to be prepared to have to make some compromises, but that's something that comes with practice. I'd hope this episode has at least given you some ideas of where to begin, so that you can find the guitar tone you want and mix it in such a way that it can sit well with everything else. And very quickly, just a note on lead guitar. If I bring up that graphic again quickly, you can see in some space there maybe where the guitar twos are. You can fit in your lead guitar a bit closer panned towards centre, maybe offset it from the main guitars and give it some space. I don't need to give you any audio examples here, but just an EQ example. Because it's lead, you're going to have less in the low end maybe, so maybe pull these down a bit further, start your shelf further, and brighten up the presence of it with a bit of a high boost. Again, you need to pull off that real high end with a low pass filter, but because it's lead, maybe a bit more presence there to help it cut through. EQing it slightly different from the rhythm guitars, and you give it a bit more character of its own as well. So that's just a quick note on them. And that concludes episode 3, part 2. Please keep an eye out for episode 4 coming in the next couple of weeks, which will cover the vocals. Thank you.